In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about 5 common mistakes that athletes make in their ACL rehab. Now, ACL rehab is a common area where mistakes can be made, and this can kind of partly explain why the rate of re-injury is so high, with as many as 1 in 3 athletes reporting re-injury post-return to sport. And the reason why this can happen is often because of mistakes in the rehab process. Perhaps, didn't have certain milestones being met or certain numbers being achieved, or perhaps it wasn't as comprehensive or as sport specific as it needed to be. So I'm going to be covering off 5 common mistakes athletes make in this process and what you can do about it to make sure that you can get back to sport in a safe and confident way, knowing that you've done everything you need to do to make sure that you reduce the risk of re-injury and return to the pitch or court, wherever sport you're playing, with absolute confidence. Now, the first one is not completing assessments. By assessments, I mean physical assessments of your current state, and as we'll be talking about in a second, also the mindset element as well. But just to focus on the physical, are you looking at your general fitness? Are you looking at things like your aerobic capacity? Are you looking at your explosive power? Are you looking at the differences between the affected and non-affected side? And are you looking at the numbers themselves? So it's all well and good knowing, is there a difference? But the numbers themselves may also be down. So to take an example of this, let's say you do some sort of maximal strength test of a single leg. Let's say you're doing something like a leg press and you're within 5% of the affected limb. Well, that would be good news from an asymmetry perspective, but actually your maximal force expression may still be quite low. So in other words, the limbs themselves are not too dissimilar, but the actual force expression of both limb isn't very good. Or if you've done something like a single leg squat jump and you're comparing sides, again, you might have no difference really, maybe like a less than 5% difference, which is great from an asymmetry perspective. But again, maybe your rate of force development on the affected side and on non-affected side is still not very good. So you actually aren't ready for explosive demands of the sport you might be returning to. None of that is known unless you're doing assessment to begin with. So you've got to base this on numbers, on something you can actually point to and say, this gives me confidence. I know that if I've achieved this criteria, these numbers, then I have got confidence that my body is ready to return to sport. Without all of this, basically you're just guessing. And there's this saying that if you're not assessing, you're guessing. So if you're not really assessing all of these different things, it's very difficult to make confident, clear decisions, because otherwise you're just basically guessing about whether you're ready or not, or just using subjective interpretation, which might have its place, but you really have got to know the numbers. And people I speak to quite frequently say, oh, I'm still a long way post-surgery and I haven't quite got there. The leg's not feeling quite right yet. My knee's not feeling strong enough. I say, what are the numbers at the moment for you? Like, oh, I don't know. Well, how could you possibly know where you are if you don't know the numbers to begin with? Kind of use this as an analogy in comparison with like a Formula One team. Like you wouldn't be going about tinkering with the engine, tuning the engine, changing the tires, looking at how the driver's performing, just based on sort of subjective feel. They wouldn't just be like, well, I think we need to change the tires now. Or they'd probably be able to see from the data that's pouring out of the engine, what the performance is looking like. Are they losing traction in certain corners? What's the power looking like from the engine? What's the performance looking like at the moment? Are the times being affected? And all of that information is what they would use to guide their decision-making process. They wouldn't just be like, finger in the air, I think we're ready to do this now. So they would use something objective, because that won't change. It is what it is. That is the facts of the situation, as opposed to just feeling like you're ready to go back or you're feeling like you're ready to progress. So making sure you've got assessment at every single stage, both in the early stage, looking at whether you've achieved those early stage markers of knee function, whether it's, are you ready to return to running yet? Are you ready to return to multi-directional sprint-based movements yet? And ultimately, are you ready to return to sport yet? All of that has got to be completed through assessment, not just through guesswork. So that's a very common mistake that athletes can make. Second one is ignoring this psychological aspect. And what I mean by this is that the majority of the rehab can sometimes focus on just the physical. In other words, just looking at how the body is functioning. Like looking at that first mistake there, you might just be looking at assessment based on how the knee is functioning, how your body's functioning, and whether the tissue is healed, whether you can express certain amounts of force, whether you can hit certain markers, whether you can hop certain distances, whatever that might be. But there's this huge component, which is the psychological aspect of going back to the sport that potentially caused the injury to begin with. So let's say, for example, you did your ACL skiing. Maybe you got your ski stuck in the snow, and the knee rotated, and you tore your ACL doing that. And now you're considering going back to skiing. Well, your body might be ready, but is your mind ready to put yourself back in the same situation that could potentially have been quite traumatic if you had a nasty injury there? Are you mentally ready to go back to that? And it's important, again, that you're assessing that component. It's not good enough just to think that, yeah, I've done all of the rehab, so I'm ready to go. Like, you have to understand, is your mindset in the right place where you're confident doing those things? So before going back to doing full sport, you've got to actually put yourself in those situations again, which caused the injury to begin with, so that you're in a strong, confident position to be able to go back to doing what you were doing before. That's a really, really important component overall. So if you're not assessing it, again, big mistake that gets made. The solution here is to assess that psychological component. There's lots of evidence-based psychological assessments that you can use here. Things like the ACL RSI or the Tampa scale of kinesiophobia, things like that have got to be included. Otherwise, you're not assessing one of the most important components of the rehab, which is actually the psychological aspect of going back to sport. Because a lot of the evidence would suggest that athletes with more fear of re-injury actually do experience a higher rate of re-injury. And that can often be explained by, not committing to certain movements in the same way, changing the way you're moving, or not necessarily committing to, actual positions you need to get into with absolute confidence. That can actually put you at more risk. So if you're not going back to sport fully confident and in a position where you think, yeah, I'm absolutely ready, I've done all the rehab and I've assessed my mindset here, and I know I'm eager to return, I'm confident, and I've done exactly what it is that caused the injury, and I'm happy with that. That's going to give you a much, much higher sense of confidence in yourself, sense in your body, and will also help to reduce the risk of re-injury in the future. So that's another massively important component there, is make sure you are assessing the psychological aspect of rehab. Number 3 is then only relying on time-based markers, not on criteria. So an example of this would be 3 months have passed, therefore you can run, or 9 months have passed, therefore you can go back to sport. Well, again, everyone's situation is different. So that might be a ballpark idea of the sort of time that it would be involved, but you have to have two things in parallel. You have to have a time-based component to give you an idea of how long you might be working with. But in parallel with that, you have to have criteria-based assessments that give you, again, objective decision-making at those time points. To give you an example, if you are looking at trying to return to running at the 3-month mark, some people might need a lot longer. Some people might be there. But simply using time is not individualizing the rehab process. It's a very blanket prescription. It's just saying once time's passed, then you can go back to sport. It would be a bit like if you were learning to drive, just saying like, once you've done 3 months of lessons, you're okay to pass. You'll be okay to go back. But again, some people take longer, some people take shorter. And that is important because it individualizes that process. So only using time is a big mistake, because by only using time, you aren't functionally assessing whether the knee is ready for the next stage or not. And that is why it's massively important to assess and have objective criteria and milestones at every single stage, because then you've got the time frame that you're roughly working towards, but in parallel with that, the criteria to make the decision on. So you need both. You need to have a rough idea of time, because that helps in your rehab process, doesn't it? It helps to know that, okay, I'm looking at around 3 months, or I'm looking at around 9 months, because what we know from human psychology is that uncertainty is a massively difficult thing to deal with. If someone just said, oh, I don't know how long that's going to take, you'd be like, is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? Is it a year? So a rough ballpark of time is very helpful because it gives something to aim for. But you've also got to kind of caveat that with, this is the rough time component. However, you've also got to hit these criteria in order to progress forward. So that is mistake number 3, only using time and not using physical markers alongside that in parallel. Number 4 is neglecting proper nutrition. See this all the time. Again, that you have to make sure you're fueling your body in the right way to aid the recovery process, because if you aren't doing so, then you're not really giving your body what it needs to recover faster. So what we see again is like all the focus on the rehab exercises, but not on the mindset and the fueling that goes into preparing you for return to sport and allowing your body to recover. Other common mistakes within this section would be not giving yourself enough energy, thinking that because you're injured, you should reduce the amount of energy massively is a big mistake. Secondly, is not getting enough protein on board, because that's a huge factor in recovery. Obviously, trying to recover tissue here, and muscle tissue and tendons. So you've got to make sure you're getting on enough protein in order to aid that recovery process over time. If you're not doing that, you're not going to help your recovery whatsoever. And it's all well and good making sure you've got those exercises in place, but are you fueling your body properly so that it's in a position where you can recover effectively? That's important. You've got to make sure you're getting on enough fuel in the right amounts at the right times to recover. And the right time is also important here. There are windows of opportunity throughout the training process where you're actually in a better position to take on board certain nutrients. So making sure that you are doing that is very, very important as well. And lastly, mistake number 5, which is something I talk about all the time, is only doing these generic rehab exercises. Now, in the early stages, there are certain things which are going to be the same for everyone, because you kind of need to have achieved certain markers, things like full knee extension, full knee flexion. So that's absolutely the right thing to do. But if you are a competitive athlete and you're trying to get back to a sport that requires explosive movements, high speed changes of direction, reactive agility, jumping, all that kind of thing, then simply doing generic movements is not going to prepare you for those things. I alluded to earlier, but if you haven't got the kind of rate of force development, high speed actions, reactive agility baked into the rehab process, then it's no surprise that you're not going to be well placed to return to a sport that demands all of those things. And that comes down to understanding your sport specific demands here. So it's not just about, hitting generic knee markers, but it's about also, are you prepared for the demands of your sport going back? And this is a huge mistake that I see quite frequently. So if you're not preparing your body for those specific demands, then you can't be surprised that you're not in a position to return effectively. And again, if you were to combine all of these things and, only do generic exercises, not do any assessment, not look at the psychological component, not consider the nutrition aspect, and overall just continue doing generic non-sport specific exercises, your risk of not getting back to sport effectively and re-injuring yourself is going to be astronomically higher than if you're doing the opposite, which is to make sure you're assessing yourself throughout the whole process with a professional. You're considering the mindset and psychological aspects of doing the movements and the actions that caused the injury in the first place, and having confidence in that knee. Not just using time, but using criteria-driven markers throughout the whole process, fueling your body through effective nutrition, and doing sport-specific rehab exercises once you've moved through these early rehab phases, that's preparing you for the demands and having something objective to compare against. So, in my sport, these are the numbers that this level of performance requires. These are the normative values for my sport. And you've compared yourself against them, and you know where you stand, and you've hit those markers as well. It's a completely different situation to be in. You're in such a stronger position to go back to doing what you love doing and taking back that control of that rehab process, because you are preparing for what it is that you need to go and do. It's not just generic. It's not just isolated muscle work or isolated kind of muscle, contraction based work in the early stages. It's making sure you're including these sport specific components as well. So I work with hockey players predominantly. If you're a hockey player in this situation, sport specific would be looking at, okay, well, it's a repeat sprint sport. So how much high intensity repeat sprint work have I included in my rehab plan? Have I included lots of high-speed agility work? Have I included lots of exercises to reduce the risk of further injuries like ankles and lower backs? Again, see this all the time, but people who haven't prepared for the demands of a sport like hockey in like very, very low positions on a frequent basis do all this rehab work on the knee and then go back on the pitch and their back's in pieces because they haven't prepared for those low positions and low sport specific demands. So you've got to piece this all together to make sure that you've got the right stuff at the right time. So those are 5 common mistakes. So in summary, to make sure you do an effective rehab process, this is what's called inversion thinking. Flip these around, make sure that you are assessing yourself and making sure that you know what your numbers are, making sure that you are considering the psychological aspect and assessing that. Make sure that you're using criteria-based markers alongside time-based frameworks, so you know where you are. Make sure you consider nutrition, you're fueling yourself properly. And then lastly, make sure you're including sport-specific exercises that prepare you for the sport-specific demands that you're going back to. That will make sure that you're in the best position possible to thrive back on the pitch when you get back and perform at your best after the ACL rehab process.